When you face a new programming challenge, it is often the hardest step to take is the first one. I'm here to help you with that. Let me show you what we were going to do. We're going to have a little task when Aunt Mary is cooking strawberry jam, and we need to fit that jam into some jars. Let me show you how that's done. Starting programming is not easy by any means, so don't worry if you feel it a little bit hard to begin. When you have a new problem and you have your empty screen, that is kind of hard to start building the skeleton of your program, and that's exactly why we are here today. I'm going to help you exactly with that. Let me show you the problem that we're going to solve. So the problem is making strawberry jam, and it's a quite simple task, so don't worry, it will be really easy for you even if you're just a beginner in Python. The point is, Aunt Mary is making strawberry jam. She has 15 jars, each of different size, and she makes a certain amount of jam, which is between 0 and 200 deciliters. Okay, we're going to use deciliters for unit of measure. Sorry if you're British or American, just think, I don't know what to think, really, a fraction of a pint or something like this. But the point is, we have a list of these capacities, 15 numbers, and we need to figure out when we run out of jam to fill into the jars, or when we run out from jars and then there is some strawberry left in the pot that Aunt Mary is using for this. This is actually a maturity exam task from last October that I took from the internet. It was set in Hungary, so it's intentionally not super hard. It's just to show that you got the basics, you got a solid grip on the basics of programming, okay? But it's good for our purposes. Okay, and the big question is, where do we begin? What's the first step to be done? And in order to answer that, the first step to begin is to think of your program as a conversion machine, okay? You are always getting some input, converting it, and then giving an output that is converted. In our case, the input is the size of the jars and the amount of jam, and the output is the amount of jars filled and the remaining amount of jam, okay? This is the conversion that we need. And even without knowing anything else, we can immediately prepare these two things, the input and the output. And the in-between will kind of come naturally if we start doing all these, okay? So let's begin with that. Luckily, I have the size of the jars right here. I don't have to do too much of that. I'm just going to copy it here. The task literally says they can be copied into the code. So I'm going to say jar sizes, and I'm just going to copy it here. Obviously, it's a list. So always, if there is a multitude of a certain nature of data, that typically goes into a list, okay? If we don't need to make any distinction between them. And the other one will be the amount of jam, right? Amount of jam, which is 0 at the moment, which is not an allowed value. Okay, but this is where I'm gonna stop right now. This is my input data, and I'm gonna put a comment here, my input data, okay? That's what happens first. And note that I have turned off AI. Very obviously, this is not a task for AI. It would do it like this. It doesn't matter which model you use. Deliberately turned off now. We are on our own, as the students in the maturity exam will indeed be. And so my output data is first of all the remaining jam, which again I will initialize to just 0, and the jars filled, which is an empty string at the moment, okay? Empty list, sorry. This is how I begin. I have my input, I have my output. And now this whole thing starts to make sense, right? Just imagine that if you would be doing this in real life, you would have the actual pot where the jam is cooking, and you would have the actual jars on the table. What would you do next when the jam is ready? You would start filling the jars one by one, right? Let's do the exact same thing. Go through all the jars and fill them with as much as possible. Okay. So in the very beginning, I will make a comment here, we start filling the jars, right? In the very beginning, what is our status? Our status says that we have all the jam is remaining because we haven't poured any of it yet, and none of the jars are filled, so all of their values is exactly 0, okay? So what we are going to do is remaining jam is equal to the amount of jam, right? Never mind that the amount of jam is 0 right now. That is just one small step that we're going to interject in between, okay? You know what? I tell you what, just for testing purposes, I'm going to say that the amount of jam is 50, okay? And then we have a value that we can go with. So imagine that you are a robot, and in this case, you will not be able to tell which jar is already filled just by looking at it. You have to remember which was the last jar you filled, or rather, you have to remember which is the next jar that you actually have to fill, okay? And then you need to keep an eye on two things. Do we still have jam left? And did we fill all the jars? Meaning the next jar filled is just out of the list of jars, okay? This is how we are going to do this. So I'm going to add next jar to fill, which is 0 in the beginning. I said 0. And don't forget that 0 means the first one in Pythonese, okay? So that's the beginning of the list. Excellent. And now what I'm going to do is I will have to create a loop to repeat filling the jars until I run out of either jam or jars. Well, how do I know if I ran out of jam? Well, very easy. The remaining jam is less than 1, meaning I have to fill the next jar while the remaining jam is greater than 0, right? Then I still have jam left. And the other condition is that I still have jars to put the jam into, right? How do I know that? The next jar to fill is actually less than the length of the list of jars, which is jar sizes, okay? This is how I know that I still have jam left and I still have jars left, okay? And now all I need to do is fill the jar with jam. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to use the jars filled list, and I'm going to add the jar filled. The question is, how much jam can I fit into that jar? Either as much as it fits, right? So the size of the jar itself, or as much jam is left, right? So the less of the two ones I will have to use. So I will say the minimum of remaining jam or jar sizes, next jar to fill. Okay. So again, what this does is we examine if we have, let's say we have 1 deciliter of jam available and the 2 deciliter jar to fill. In this case, obviously, we're just going to put 1 deciliter of jam into the jar. If we have 3 deciliters of jam remaining and we have a 2 deciliter jar, we put 2 in there. So always the less of the 2 values. Okay, brilliant. I have filled this jar. What I need to do next is mentally move my focus to the next jar. So I'm done with this one. I need to move next jar to fill to the next one. But also, I have filled out a certain amount of jam, so I need to take care of that as well, and I will need to subtract the amount of jam I filled into the jar from the jam in the pot, that is the remaining jam. I'm gonna use this function. Last jar filled is the item that I have just added to it. Let me make it a little bit more readable. Sorry about this. Okay, jam to fill. Okay, and jam to fill will be the actual amount. Of course, I fill jam to fill, and I subtract jam to fill from the remaining jam. There you go. Okay, so again, I have two conditions on continuing the operation. The first one is I still have jam to fill into the jars, I still have jars to fill the jam into, right? And this is right here. And then I determine the amount of jam that I can fill to the next jar, which is the least amount of either the remaining jam or the size of the jar to fill it into, okay? And then I'm just taking note that I have filled the jam into that jar, reducing the amount of jam in the pot with that quantity and move to the next jar. That's all I need to do. Great, this is pretty much all that we had to do. Now we have quit this loop, meaning we ran out of jam or we ran out of jars. It says, if the jar's combined capacity is sufficient, display sufficient jars available. How do I know that? When there is no remaining jam. So if remaining jam is 0, then I will say, what was it? Sufficient jars available. And the only other option is some jam was left over, right? There is no third option. Either I ran out of jam or I ran out of jars. If both happened at the same time, so old Mary was smart and she did exactly as much jam as jars she had, then we still ran out of jam. That means sufficient jars are available. If I would be doing it the other way around, and I would say if remaining jam, if the number of jars ran out, so we have no more jars left, then I would say some jam was left over even if there was none. So this is kind of a ordering thing that you first need to think of the positive case in this specific problem. Okay, let me see what happens. Sufficient jars available. Let me do one more thing to make it a bit more readable. Let me print the jars filled, okay? So this will show us how many jars have been filled. And there you go. You can see that there is not all of the jars were filled. Let me do this. Let me print the original jars as well so we can see actually what happened here. And you can see that we had a lot of jars and the last one was actually a much bigger one than jam left. So we just stopped about halfway filling all the jars. Excellent. This task is complete. And then it says determine the largest jar's capacity and its position in the list. Brilliant, let's do this as well. This is actually quite simple. All we need to do is take note of the largest jar we have seen so far, and if we see a bigger one, then go ahead and take note of that, okay? So what we are going to do is we're gonna say biggest jar we saw so far, biggest jar size, and I'm gonna put 0. And the biggest jar index is, I'm gonna also put 0, it doesn't really matter, okay? That's the biggest jar we have seen so far. Well, we never saw a single one, so it's 0, that's perfectly logical. And then here, when I get here, first I'm gonna say, let's see if this is the biggest jar we ever saw, okay? How do I know that? That's the jar size, next jar to fill. Yeah, that's the jar size that we are at right now. And if this is bigger than the biggest jar size, then yes, this is the biggest jar so far, right? And then all I have to do is remember that this is the biggest one. So I will just say biggest jar size is equal to jar sizes, the one we are processing right now, okay? And the biggest jar index is actually next jar to fill, right? Because that's the number of the jar that we are just filling, okay? And then what we say is print, that I'm gonna use an F string here, biggest jar size is, what was the name? Biggest jar size, it's on position, please. Biggest jar index, very simple, excellent. Okay, let's see if this works. Needless to say, it does. The biggest jar size is 10, it's on position 0. Excellent, very simple. It's the mindset that you need to know, that this is how you check for something that is an extreme of a series of values, okay? you pretend that there is no extreme, and then whenever you see one that is more extreme than the one we saw so far, you always update your list, okay? That's the algorithm to follow. Not hard, really. Okay, and now the only thing that we have to do is prompt the user to input, okay? And this is, again, super duper simple because we can assume that it will be fine. And I'm just going to do, first I'm going to do the wrong way. How many deciliters of jam does Aunt Mary cook? Okay, and this is the bad way because this returns a string. I need to convert that to an integer. Okay, brilliant. Okay, now all I need to do is run this, and I can make 150 deciliters of jam. And then obviously we see that all the jars were filled and some jam was left over. Actually, let me show how much jam was left over by turning this into an F string and saying remaining jam deciliters. Okay. Okay, let me see how much was left. 150 deciliters, by the way, is a huge quantity of jam. You would never eat that. 79 was left over. Okay, that is perfectly fine. Let me just put one space here because it's more aesthetic like this. Okay, here we go. This is our little solution to the problem. So again, remember how we began just by getting the input data, and then we defined the output data. And that kind of gave us a good hint on how to start filling the output data, and that yielded us a proper result. So that's the strategy that I suggest for you to follow. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you took something out of it. Maybe it helped you start with a little project. If you are still stuck, let me know in the comments. I am really glad to help you out, as long as there are not 10,000 comments per day, but I hope this will happen as well. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.